Hi, my name is Mike Coggins, and welcome to the Real World Research for Everyone podcast, and I'm your host. This podcast is a risk for me, but when I think about it, I have taken some risks in my life. Not the kind where I jump off a mountain in a squirrel suit, which I've never done, but I have changed my career path 6 times, and I'm 50 years old. I've also tried to pick up some hobbies in my older ages and some outside pursuits besides work or school or anything like that, with minimal knowledge. And perhaps the greatest risk of all is that I continue trying. In fact, not trying scares me more than failing. It scares me more than having no success at all at any point in time. My trying is my rebellion against fear and against anyone else's opinion about success and achievement. In fact, I believe that doing is achieving, and achieving is more important than achievement. I'm starting this concept podcast in the middle. It's in the middle of mine and other people's attempts to better understand ourselves through internal signals which we can read out here in the external world. But this isn't a biohacking conversation. It's a discovery conversation by trying to understand the newer part of us that we think of ourselves, which is this part of the brain basically right here, and the quieter, more ancient parts of ourselves, which nevertheless are very important and internally communicate with the rest of us. So I hope you risk and try, and if you do, please share. If you're unsure, if you're a little hesitant, if you're apprehensive about risking, trying, and failing, I hope you continue with us, because I firmly believe that the more people who try and risk, the better the chances of making this world wonderful over and over again. So who am I? I am a coach, a health coach, I'm a personal trainer, and I'm a physiological researcher. Basically, I try and help people excel in the real world through a process of guessing what to do, doing it, and then evaluating the results. This podcast is about our risking, trying, and doing with the purpose of sharing the process and the challenges rather than say just facts. We want to share the fact that the joy and the challenge of banging our head against a wall, seeing stars in our eyes, and somewhere in the sparks there, we come up with a new idea. This is our episode 1. This is our pilot. Welcome to the Maelstrom. So what I want to start off with today, since I mentioned biological signals, I mentioned I am a physiological researcher out in the real world. I don't work in a lab, an academic lab, that we're going to combine those two things, and we're going to talk about some really detailed aspects of using products which a lot of people can purchase. So the idea here is, and take this with a grain of salt, that what you might have read or seen on a video is often based on what's done in an academic lab. And academic labs have the benefit of trying to control as many variables as possible to figure out, how something works and why. But what we do out in the real world is more about what and when. So it's called translational research. There's a huge growing body of literature having to do with more the medical side of diseases and treatments for diseases, and a number of exercise physiology academic works also try and work in the real world, but the purpose is different because we can't control variables out here. In fact, it's very, very difficult. And in one of the future podcasts I hope to do is to bring in other aspects of the process of how to design experiments if you want to do them even on yourself, or if you're a trainer or an academic, if you're an athletic trainer, work with a team, how you can do these things in the real world where you actually have a fair chance to find something out, as opposed to just getting random piece of information that you think is true. So we'll hopefully cover that at a later time. But for today, wearable products in the real world represents a great area. There's over 1 billion wearable products that essentially check either heart rate or pulse rate, amongst other sensors, usually accelerometers for your movement, and occasionally temperature or other things like the amount of blood oxygen you have in your body. So an example of a device that can have some level of biological measurements is the PolarTec H10. So here it is here. You wear this on a strap. This goes right here. You lock it into place. You have to wet this first so you actually have a little bit of conductance. That's important because of what this actually measures. So let's take a second. This has electric leads in it with water. Now you have electricity and water, and essentially what happens is when the nerve impulse comes down to your heart, a whole lot of individual nerve cells fire, and that creates a pretty big electrical change right here where that device is measuring you. And I'm sure you've seen something like this before on an EKG. You get a little bump, boom, boom. That is something that this device can pick up. And what it outputs, what a person like me can actually see if you have one of the handful of apps which allow you to do this, is that you get a time between these peaks. So this might be 989 milliseconds. This might be 997 milliseconds. And so what you would get out from a device like this is a running list of those numbers and at what time it was measured. So that is, this has been studied for many years. This came out of endurance laboratories that wanted to try and help Olympic level athletes, university level athletes, professional athletes increase their cardiovascular capability. And there's quite a bit of research on this particular device, both in labs as well as at least a handful of using this device out in the real world. Now, specifically, they use it with heart rate training and heart rate understanding with metabolism, which we'll come to a little bit later in this podcast. That's kind of what this device does. Another device, which has even more people using it, is something like this. This is a Scosche. It's essentially, technology-wise, very similar to an iWatch. It goes onto this area of your body. You wear it here. I think Whoop straps are worn a little bit differently. Whoop straps also have a version of this technology, which is called PPG for short. It stands for photoplethysmography. You won't be able to see this because I'm not going to turn on just yet, so don't worry in case you're watching this. There are these 3 light-emitting diodes, LEDs, and in between them is a little, essentially, collector of the light that gets bounced back. So I'm going to turn this on. If you have issues with flashing lights, please, turn away or fast forward, whatever you want to do. I'm not going to do this very long, but I want people to see that when you turn it on, the part that's going against my skin looks like that. And that has 2 green LEDs and kind of an orangish one. The wavelengths of light chosen for those, I'm turning it off, is designed to try and go a certain distance underneath the skin and then backscatter, basically bounce back up and be collected by that little internal collection area. That is, those particular wavelengths also are supposedly, it's not 100% clear, but supposedly they bounce off of, hemoglobin in your red blood cells. So the more red blood cells, essentially when your artery, your veins open up and blood gets rushing through after a heartbeat, then you would have a signal there. Now that signal, I'll show it, is a little bit more blurred because there's skin, there's some light reflectance issues and technological problems with trying to do something that's truly non-invasive, that's visual, that's light. And it's very difficult to get light to go through your body because your body's skin is designed to stop that. That's why we have things like getting tan or melanin. And if you could actually see the output of this, which you can occasionally in certain devices will let you do it, especially if you're a researcher, it's not quite as crisp as that. It looks a little bit more like it's kind of blurred out a little bit. It's kind of longer. But again, what you'd get in your output is you would get either, depending upon how the device does it, either a time just like that, might be 991 and this one is 999, or sometimes they change that into a rate. We'll come back to this in a little bit. I don't want to get into rates just yet, but essentially you can see there's a difference in how crisp these outputs are, and you can see that the way when you get a file out of an app on your phone, you're going to get a list of some kind of numbers and when they happened, okay? Also, I have an Aura Ring. This is a very similar technology as this right here. It also has another sensor in it that does temperature. So basically, your two choices are either more of this version. So again, come back to Polar Tech. It is an ECG, a single lead ECG. So there's one lead. Electrocardiogram is the style of this device, and it measures input into your heart before your heart beats. So there's an important point here about how and when these devices work. Here, nerve signal comes in, it changes the essentially electrical properties of all those little cardiac cells at pretty much the same time because it's going the speed of electricity. And you get a beat from your atria to your ventricles, and then your ventricles beat out. So you have out here, blood goes out this way to your body, out the aorta, or it goes back to your lung through the pulmonary artery. And what happens then is that blood pulse spreads throughout your body, and it takes time to be seen different distances from this aorta. In fact, there's, if I wore this, which I would since it doesn't work with tattoos, if I wore this out here, it might take 100 milliseconds to get out there, maybe 150. And so that time gets baked in a little bit. There's always going to be a little bit of error between when these two events happen. But the hope, and there's very little research behind this, by the way, we'll come back to this in another podcast when we get into some real nitty-gritty stuff, is that the time between these events, even though this is shifted a little bit because it takes a little bit longer to get out here, your blood does, is that it would be the same. And I purposely drew them to be slightly different. Now that is a yellow flag right there. I mentioned the podcast is less about facts than it is about process. And I can tell you, having looked at close to 500 to 1,000 of these, it is almost never the same number. It's close. And it might be close enough for the error we care about. But I will, I'll put my hat down on that right there, that there's no strong research that I've ever seen that doesn't show that there's error. Matter of fact, every study I've looked at shows that there's error. So we should take that as a part of the process. There's going to be some error. Is it enough to matter? We'll come back to that later. Okay, so let's take a pause, because that's kind of detail-y. There's some facts in there, a little bit of the process. Let's go back to another part of the process. Let's tell a story. Why did I even start to care about this kind of stuff? So my life journey was, I was working at Credit Suisse, the investment bank, which no longer exists, and I hated every day of my life. I really did. It was the worst experience I've ever been through, which is saying something. And I would get up in the morning at 4 a.m. and I would commute in to, I believe that's Madison Square Park. And I would go to an Equinox there on 19th and Broadway. I was a member, and I would work out at 5 a.m. So I'd get there right when the staff got there until about 6. I'd shower. I'd be at the desk by 6:30. And as I worked out, I could just feel the anxiety and the dislike and awfulness just increase until I was at that desk, and then I would leave who knows when. Maybe I'm lucky and it's a 7 or 8 o'clock, I get to leave. Maybe I'm unlucky and as I stay overnight. I did that for not very long. But because I did that, I learned some things about myself, and perhaps the best thing you can learn in a situation like that is what you really don't like. Because then, once you sort of understand it, if you really understand it, you don't have to do it again, right? You can find something else where you might like it, so it's different. Or if you know some things you like, you gravitate more towards that. I took a month off, I traveled, I saw family, I saw friends, and on a lark, I used this crazy thing called Craigslist to apply for a personal trainer job at Equinox, where I used to be a member, where I was a member. I canceled my membership by then. Because my thought process was, I'm going to go applying for jobs, I need a gym to go to, and I would, the way this works, usually it's kind of like a part-time job when you start as a personal trainer. It's certainly not 80-hour weeks like working in an investment bank. So I did. I interviewed. I was accepted. I ended up doing some internships that summer. I'd applied for some other jobs in consulting where I worked before finance. And at the end of the summer, in like late August, early September, I sort of realized that the people I talked to, I learned so much from the other trainers and some members who were very knowledgeable that blew my mind. I came from a pretty narrow background. I'd played a handful of different sports when I was young, kind of got narrowed down to a few when I was in the college, late high school, college years. And the only types of sort of training using a gym I'd ever been exposed to was what I later learned, very basic stuff built off of bodybuilding and some low level early days of physical therapy. And that's kind of the world that it was. But it wasn't, say, what a professional athlete would do in their off season. It wasn't, let's say, what high end college, collegiate programs would do in order to like balance out some things with their athletes, right? Maybe your athlete is fast, but he's at risk of injury. I had no idea of these worlds. Despite I actually had a college basketball off-season training program when I was 19? Yeah, I was 19. So it blew my mind. I decided I wanted to stay and try to make a go of this and learn more. And so one of the things I learned in those early days working for Equinox was about heart rates and their relationship with metabolism. And that matters because depending upon what your goal is, whether you're an athlete, a weekend athlete, or you don't care about athletics at all, you just care about trying to stay healthy, maybe look good, it impacts how you might want to think about what to do for your weeks and your months. Okay, so let's use that as a little bit of a bridge into heart rate training. Okay, so heart rate training is using a rate of your heart beats per minute in order to understand what is going on internally. All these devices, right? Oura Ring, which isn't great at this while you're exercising. It's actually seemingly better for when you're sleeping. So this is more of I would put this more of in the recovery from your workout sort of valuable device. This, though, the Scosh and the Polartec H10, these are used extensively in heart rate training. So let's take a break. Heart rate. The easiest way I've thought of this, and I hope this helps with you, is you've got a heart rate right now. You're sitting around and sometimes, you might have had like a nurse or yourself or a doctor tell you to do this, or they've done it for you, or they check on your wrist and they'll mark down a number. So let's say right now for me, if I just sit around and held my hand there, I'd get 61, 60, 59, 58. Now those numbers would come more from a device, which is showing each time my heartbeat, what is the rate. But the other way, that you do it typically as a person is you sit around and count for 20 seconds and times it by 3, or 30 seconds and times it by 2, and that would give you one of these numbers. That's an average heart rate for, let's say, the 20 seconds or 30 seconds that you chose to do it. When these devices output, they give you the rate at each beat. How can there be a rate at each beat of your heart? Because your heart is a lot like the engine in a car. And the rate that you're seeing is your speedometer. So hopefully, folks, watching this or listening to this, you have used a device like a motorized bike, motorcycle, car, something that has a speedometer on it. If you have, great, this is easy. If you haven't, write to me, let me know, and I'll try and come up with a better analogy. The speedometer, if the way it works is this, like let's say you have your foot on the gas, you're on a highway, it might say you're going 61 miles per hour. And what that really means is that if nothing changes, like literally nothing outside of the car, the wind doesn't change, you're not going up a hill, you're not going down a hill, someone doesn't pass you, like a huge truck pass you, if nothing changes, you don't go over gravel, and nothing changes inside of the car. You don't take your foot off the gas. You don't put your foot on the brake, right? Nothing like that happens. That means that if nothing happens, you will go, in that case, 61 miles in 1 hour. For heart rates, it's 61 beats per minute. So again, it's like an event, miles, in this case, beats, and there's a time. So for cars, or maybe per hour or per kilometer, and if it's for heart rates, it's per minute. So this means if nothing changed, my heart would beat 61 times in that 1 minute. Okay. We're good. Now, there's ways to change your heart rate, and that's why these numbers change. If you had a pacemaker, or if you have a pacemaker, that's kind of like having cruise control on your car. The idea there is that pacemaker is going to say, nope, we're going to go 70 pretty much no matter what. And that's what cruise control does too, right? So if you start going down a hill, it actually slows you down a little bit so that you're still going 61 miles per hour, okay? Now, these are numbers. Let's take a brief pause. Let's talk about what's underneath. Why do these numbers happen? Somewhere in this mid part of your brain in the back, you have an area of an old part of your brain which sets these numbers for you. So maybe I'm in the upper 50s, lower 60s. Maybe if you're sitting there, you're in the 70s, or you're in the 50s if you're a runner. Maybe you're in the 40s if you're a really good runner. But somewhere back in there, if you're not doing very much, if you're just sitting here kind of like I am, it won't change a whole lot, right? It doesn't go 61, 400 to 150, 95. It stays pretty close. Those are all pretty close, and that's pretty normal to what might look like for me, right? This next one might be back to 60, 62, 61. Like that's pretty normal, right? And the reason those are changing a little bit is because most likely something inside of you is telling your heart rate to change a little bit. And you have two sets of nerves. Remember I described the nerves that come in here that tell your heart when to beat. You have two sets of nerves that have the ability to speed up your heart rate. That's one set of them. And the other set, very different, is like the brake. It slows things down. And it's the interplay between those two, and they're chemically modified. So one of them is due to adrenaline, which I'm sure you've heard of. That is, I got scared, my heart rate went up, I gotta run. Or maybe you get excited, right? Like there's the end of my race. I've just gotta make it to that before this person. And so your heart rate will go up. Alternatively, when you sleep, so your recovery, when you decide you want to do some breath work, maybe you want to meditate, maybe you're just reading a really calm book after a bad day. I realize I keep saying books. Books are important. I'll tell you that. If you calm yourself down, you're effectively putting the brake on to your heart rate, and it comes down a little bit. But there's always this little bit of jitter that happens because there's parts of you that are always deciding, like, do I need to speed up my heart rate or do I need to slow down my heart rate? And there's other ways that are less obvious that might be challenging your heart rate too. Like it could be something going on with your gastrointestinal tract or your liver. It could be your immune system if you're fighting something, right? Physiology, the degree I have from graduate school, is how each part of you interacts with the other. So it's communication based as opposed to being an expert on what does the liver do and all the problems that can happen and what do you do about those problems. I don't have that kind of knowledge. My knowledge is more sensory systems work was what I did as a thesis, and it's how parts of you communicate and work with each other so that the whole of you is alive and functional and hopefully doing well, and in our case, excelling. Okay, so there's a brief little side into the physiology behind the numbers. The chemical for the slowing down is acetylcholine. So you have noradrenaline or norepinephrine speeds things up. Those are different terms for the same chemical. And there's acetylcholine slows things down at your heart. So you have two sets of input to your heart, which is measured by this. And those cause your heart to beat a little bit faster or a little bit slower. And if you, for example, you choose the exercise, it's going to go way faster. And once you stop your exercise, it's going to come down pretty quick, hopefully. Okay, so that is heart rates. How did that come about being part of training? People started to wonder what heart rates mean for what's going on with other parts of your body. So it turns out there's a pretty good relationship, and I want to do a quick plug here before I start to describe things. This is the book that I read. It's by Roy Benson, Declan Connolly. It's called Heart Rate Training. It's got to be dated by now because this is probably like 2005, something like that. What is it? 2011. But they might have updated, they might not have. It's still a great resource to understand some of the basics. And even though maybe maybe. Some of the facts in here have now been expanded upon or changed. What they went through and what they talk about other researchers went through to figure things out, super important. Again, process matters. Understanding how you have to figure things out by just like how do you make sure that this isn't the case when you think this is the case, or what are the other options it could be? How do you rule them out? How do you use them once you have a better idea? And how do you, once you decide to use them, come back around and say, was I right? Was I right for this person? Was I right for this event or this particular goal? Because there's a lot of variables, once again, out here in the real world. So we have to be very process oriented, we have to be very detail oriented. We have to come back and constantly challenge our assumptions, our knowledge, because if you haven't been with a trainer, if you aren't a trainer, if you haven't been with a sports team, you will be amazed at how much difference there can be, even though it seems like, well, I gave you all the same training program, right? Or I did something that was personalized for you and it worked for these 5 people, but it didn't work for these 2 people. It happens all the time. And that's the job of someone like me, is to say, why? What did I think was going to happen? Why did I think it was going to happen? And why didn't it happen? How do I change that so that person gets what they want, what they need? Okay, so with these rates, the researchers started to look into what's going on. And I'll break it down into 3 basic ideas that cover everything, so you can we'll start from that. That's pretty easy to understand. When you're asleep, or when you're like laying down and doing absolutely nothing, that is about the lowest heart rate you're gonna have. So I won't erase it just yet. You are gonna have here, I'm gonna draw this. This is, we'll call this heart rate, right? There is a lower floor that you have as a person. And that lower floor, it could change a little bit, right? Especially, like I said, if let's say you haven't done anything in a while, and you decide you want to go running and you want to get back into it, or you want to get into cycling or the elliptical and you start getting back into it, that number might drop a little bit. But there's always like some sort of lower limit, right? You never hear about anyone having a 30 resting heart rate, because if you have a 30, you're on your way to coding and you're about to die. So this is one of those areas where less isn't always better. There's a lower limit, and once you get past that lower limit, you are probably having a really bad event. And I don't mean the bad event to be a joke. I do mean the joke part is, lower isn't always better. Conversely, higher is not always better. If your heart goes up really, really high, you are in cardiac arrest, and you are about to die a different way. So there is also an upper limit up here for a person. You're going to be different than me. I'm going to be different from you. One of the earlier researchers who came around, he was looking at a lot of different ages of people, and in his data he saw a trend that roughly 220 minus the person's age is the maximum. He didn't say that was supposed to be the maximum. Some people kind of took that and ran with it too far. He had to kind of come back in at some point, I forget, it's like in the 2000s, and say, look, I think you're overusing my data to do something that's just not specific enough. It's not accurate enough. So one of the things I did, I'll put this in the notes, is the people I've worked with over time, 230 minus age is okay. Alternatively, I try and figure out this range first. So I'll have them check their lower level one, and then we'll do something that's fairly tough, and I'll put a little, I'll add a little fudge factor to it, because almost nobody gets to their actual max heart rate. That's right before the point where you would say pass out. And, once we have that range, we can do what we're going to want to do anyways, which is we're going to try and figure out what happens in the range. And it turns out from a lot of the research that was done is that you basically have 3 ranges. Now, pause for a second. If you have been told there's like zone 1 through 5, or sometimes I've even heard 7, they're all the same basic idea, right? Which is that somewhere about here, you have now 3 ranges where you can be, which is, let's say here. So this is zone 1. So technically, I want you to think of the zone as including the line itself, this one here. That's a very narrow zone. So because there's different sizes, there's different numbers of these zones, some people break this one into 2, some people break this one also into 2, and that would give you the zone 5. But in reality, there's really kind of like 3 main areas: zone 1, zone 2, zone 3. I put that right around that spot right there, and then zone 3 is this spot right here. Zone 1 is this larger area here. And what the researchers found was your heart rate is reflective of how much energy you are using. So now we have a combination of what your heart is doing and what your metabolism is doing. Metabolism is affecting every other part of your body, and the two big areas of your body that matter for health, wellness, movement, sports performance, all those types of things are your skeletal muscle and your brain. And those use up a ton of energy that you have previously eaten and your body has stored either in what's called ATP, which is cash in your wallet. It's a molecule in your cells, every cell, that's designed to be used quickly for energy. Or it's stored as something called glycogen or glucose. You have glucose in your blood. That's why it tastes sweet and salty sometimes. Also, if you're like a diabetic, you'll know a lot about glucose. And or muscle glycogen, which is stored inside your cells, mostly muscle cells, but also sometimes in your liver as well. And that is a little bit more packaged form of glucose. So glucose, think of it as like your, it's not quite as like a check, if anyone still uses checks. If you don't use a check, it's like a money transfer, trying to transfer from your, your Venmo to your PayPal or to your bank. It takes a little bit longer to get used because your body has to essentially unwind the packaging, break it up into the smallest parts, and then it can use it. So it takes time to break it apart and use it, okay? And then there's also fat. Fat takes the longest time because it's really packaged up, which is why a little bit of fat on you has a tremendous amount of energy because your body has figured out over all this time, like how to efficiently, not just ours, like how to pack fat and store energy that takes longer to unwind, but you get way more energy in the same small size as you would for muscle glycogen or ATP. So it's very efficient in terms of space. It is very inefficient in terms of how long it takes to get the energy out of it. What that means is since it takes a long time to get the energy out of it, you can only use fat for things that are slow. Because if you do something fast, fat hasn't had time to break down yet. And then, you have to use something else. So what they figured out was this, zone 1, is where you get to use fat. Mostly. And way up in here, where you're going, you're running towards this, sprinting for the finish line, or you're trying to get away from a bear, whatever it is, where your heart rate is really high for you, you don't have time to support how fast you're moving through fat. You have to use that ATP. So this is the ATP zone. And then in between is when you're also using carbohydrates, whether it's blood glucose, so the sugar that's actually in your blood getting transported around, or the areas of your body that have some glycogen inside the cells already. So you have some that's already stored, a little bit, and then your blood can get some through. So now, of course, if you're running and you need to get blood to your legs with that glucose, and you need to get oxygen there, and you need to get rid of some of the waste. Lactic acid is one of those things, but also just generally ions, hydrogen ions, which are going to raise your pH. You have to pump blood faster. That's why your heart rate goes up. So the big understanding here from the research of these folks plus tons of others is that your heart rate is reflective of your metabolism, which is tied intimately to what you're doing. And so if you're, let's say, taking a nice walk outside, I'm in New York City, I'm on the east side right now. It is a terrible day to take a walk. It's about to thunderstorm in the summer. What is that nonsense? I could basically support my walking by burning a little bit of fat. And so if you've ever seen numbers on a treadmill, and it says like, oh, you used 200 calories today on this treadmill, that's probably mostly fat. You also use probably a little bit of that muscle glycogen and glucose in your bloodstream because you're probably somewhere up in here a little bit with your heart rate. If you decided you wanted to go at something that's a little bit challenging, there comes a point where your breathing gets challenged, and that is known as the lactate threshold. So that's this kind of like line and little box around it. That is a heart rate where you're using less and less fat, and essentially once you get to and more carbohydrates, so again glucose and muscle glycogen, then when you get to that point, that level of intensity and whatever it is you're choosing to do, that there you can no longer support your activity with fat and oxygen, because you need oxygen to break down the fat. So for example, sprinters, when they're way up in here, they don't breathe. Your 100-meter dash people, almost none of them in the Olympics breathe. They have their breath, they go, 10 seconds later they're done. They didn't take a single breath. It was of no value to them because they're using the cash in the wallet, ATP. They don't have time for oxygen to break down fat, right? Now, in that area right here, this zone 2 where you're by your lactate threshold, what's also happening is because you can't use the oxygen and because you're having to use carbohydrates, you get waste products. That's lactic acid, and that's those hydrogen ions that are changing your blood pH. That's why sometimes like your vision might get narrowed or you might get nauseous. That is the zone that is really, really challenging to deal with. Hockey lines often deal right around there. High-level rowers doing 10,000, 20,000 meters, right around there. You will find certain positions on a soccer field sometimes right around there for a little bit. Like a defender maybe has to go up and like actually try and score and has to get back. They might have spent 45, 50 seconds in this area. Basketball occasionally, although basketball more frequently goes between here and here these days. But it depends. I mean, it's a run and gun show, you might be in here. And lots of other sports will be somewhere in this spectrum. You can kind of tell based upon how many breaks you need to take for that sport. Okay, so now we know that metabolism is based upon, so what you're doing will determine what you're using in your metabolism, and that determines how fast your heart has to beat. And what these devices were able to figure out, right, is where in this area are you when you choose to do that. And it's not always clear, right? You could take a guess with something like a formula like this, but if you want to try and excel in the real world, you have to get a little bit more specific than that usually. And so you could take one of these devices and you could try and figure out, okay, where am I probably at? And if you compare it with how you're feeling, you'll get a little bit closer, because if you're feeling like I might throw up, you're probably close to this. If you're completely out of breath, you're close to the top one. You know, if you're having a good time, you're by somewhere in this bottom area, right? It's great. If I can talk to you, I'm down here somewhere going slow enough where I can use fat. So quick story time, when I moved from Equinox to Lifetime, I ended up, I was one of the first management people to open the Lifetime Sky, which is their first location in Manhattan. It was on 42nd and 11th. It had a special basketball court in the basement, which was built for Carmelo Anthony because he lived in the building. I'm going to name drop because he was there. Some other Knicks players were there, a few, like one or two Jets players, at least one Mets player was there. It was a pretty cool place to work. And one of the things that particular Lifetime had, and I think a lot of them have this as well, was they combine now this device, which is a little bit easier for some people. A lot of women don't enjoy this polar tech necessarily. And also other types of folks that might chafe your skin and not like it. These devices are easier, just wear it here. They combined this with a gas mask that tried to read out that oxygen and carbon dioxide, right? That's kind of right by here where it really changes. And so the combination now of reading this, and this does pulse rate, remember, this is out here. This is after your heart has beat. So as the blood pulse comes out, this reads that. That's what it looks like. If you could actually look at the little visual aspect of those sensors. It's not quite the same as this. But remember, the premise is that it's close enough. Okay? And so with those two things together, they could get more detailed version of where and how big these areas are for you, and then what? Build a training program that's personalized. So that's that next step where it's, where are you at right now and what do you want to do? Okay, let's put those two things together. Here's your training plan. And that's awesome. So that is Real world, and I've done that a number of times. I probably went through a program at least 6 times when I was there over the years. It worked every time in terms of helping. Is it the best program? We never know the answer to that question. That's a classic question that is too difficult to answer in the real world. What is the best program? It's more about, did it work? And did it work enough that makes sense for how long you did it? If I did a month-long program and I'm expecting like, all right, hopefully I can shave, let's call it like 15 or 30 seconds off of my 2-mile time or something like that, 1.5-mile time, because I have an old military background. We use that a lot. It should make sense, right? And if it makes sense that your improvement towards that goal and that amount of time makes sense, it's a good training program for you. Okay, let's move into the next thing here, which is heart rate variability. This gets talked a lot about. Online, I've seen so many, basically the same stuff over and over again. Heart rate variability, technically, and there's going to be some people that might disagree with me, and that's okay. We're all allowed to be wrong. My choice for this is based upon my belief that since this works on the input to your heart and it is nerve related, and there's pretty much almost never does the nerves tell your heart to beat, and it doesn't. It's really rare. So this matches when your heart beats. So this measures heart rate variability. After your heart beats, blood pulses out. So in my world, this thing measures pulse rate variability. And as you can guess, the big question is, are they the same at every point in time, under every circumstance? We'll come back to this later because there's enough evidence now, I believe, that they do not measure the same thing at every point in time. Now that might not matter, right? There's the edge cases where they're clearly different. Might not be you, and might not matter for what you care about, okay? So these could be equally good for you, and that's totally fine. But there are people out there alive right now where they are decidedly measuring different things. And a big question is why or how? That, remember, is academic labs. Out here, we deal with what and when. So if under the circumstance of things you and I care about, that when we care about them, they work, great, we can use them interchangeably. But we'll come back to that later because that work hasn't been done. All right, so heart rate variability now. Heart rate variability is why these numbers, or is reflective of, it's a measurement of, why these numbers are different. So I remember I mentioned that there's kind of these two different tracks of nerves. One's more like an accelerator, one's more like a brake. They constantly are doing some level of talking to the heart, and you'll get this little jitter, right? This one is 989, this one's 997. That is different. Even though, and also you can see the difference here, even though it's not that big a difference, right? We're talking a little bit, but it happens over and over again. So what heart rate variability really is a measurement of how much difference is there for whatever period of time you choose to measure it. And there's different views on that, but probably out in the real world, about 5 minutes is enough. A lot of research looked at 10 minutes for quite a while. 5 minutes seems to be probably about as good, because in 5 minutes, if you're not doing anything, if you had 60 beats a minute, 5 minutes, that's 300 beats. You can compare, that's enough to feel comfortable that, it's not so small that you're getting a very skewed number. If I only checked 2 numbers, maybe that's not real. You might not need to go to 10 times 60, 600 values to get an understanding of what's going on. And also it balances this idea that depending upon what you just did, or what was going on relatively recently in your life, there might be some changes that are kind of like longer term happening. Let's say, you took a run an hour ago. Your heart rate might be coming down a little bit, a little bit of a dip there. Testing for 10 minutes would give you a little bit, maybe more variation than is real, just because so much has changed. You're basically recovering. So that is one area. We'll come back to that another point in time, which is that heart rate variability is meant to be measured under what's called steady state conditions. That's a mathematical term. The physiological term is under homeostatic conditions. And those are about the same idea. The math might be different, but the basic idea is, again, if nothing's changing, nothing should change. So if you're gonna, if you're gonna wake up in the morning and your Aura Ring tells you your heart rate variability before you woke up, when I wasn't doing anything, right? I mean, my brain might have been going crazy and having some crazy dreams, but if it tells you that, your heart rate variability was, and it's gonna give you a number usually, let's say it's 85, and it has a little ms after it, 85 milliseconds. That is a measurement of the difference between these two or every single one, added up, and then averaged. So that if you see a number on your phone, on your whatever device, your app, and it gives you a number, it's going to tell you that it's measuring an average difference. So in this case, this is 8 milliseconds. If that was true all across the board for however long I measured, it would say 8. That's what it was. It's going to give you the average of that error over the amount of time that you chose to measure it, which is usually 1 minute 5 at most these days with these products, occasionally 10. And that variability is supposed to reflect how much talking is going on between those two sets of nerves. That is the current hypothesis out there in the physiology anatomical literature. And there hasn't really been much to challenge that and say that it's something different. But remember, that is based upon work that was done with these types of devices. So they used actually dogs in the classic experiment in nature. They used dogs and they used channel blockers to say what part of the variation, or can you get the variation to change if I block either the fast heart fibers, the sympathetic heart fibers, or the slowing down the brakes, the parasympathetic heart fibers. And through some work, they basically could see that at the level of these type of devices, ECGs here, is that you could block part of what's going on with either one of those. So, and if you put them both in there, the heart would, the dog would go into cardiac arrest, which I don't believe they actually tried to do. I think thank God, they had some animal cruelty ideas that were better. The interesting thing is, even though they blocked one of these pathways, the heart still, beat at about the same rate. The rate didn't change a whole lot, just the amount of variation changed. So again, that tells you kind of have two things going on. You have a longer term thing from back in here. It says, for you, Mike, you're going to have about a 60 when you're doing nothing. For John, it's a 50. For Lucy, it's 55. And you could change a little bit of the jitter depending upon what you did, but you didn't stop the heart. Okay, so it's kind of like there's something else going on that you can basically, in your body, other parts of your body can communicate and say, I need a little bit more of this versus this, or this is what's going on here, I'm informing you, and then and that's somehow we can hopefully use that, us out here in the real world. Okay, so that's variation. Now, there's two different types. I'm not going to do the math today. We'll do another podcast with the actual math between what are the two most common numbers. One is known as SDNN. I'll come back to this. This one you see less frequently, SDNN, or there's RMSSD. The main difference is that SDNN takes each one of these beats, how long it took in between. So each one of these intervals, call it that. And it compares to the average interval for that, again, length of time. So if I did 5 minutes, it'll compare each one of these to the average, and the difference is the variation. So again, if the average was, let's say 1,000, this one would have 11 and this one would have 3. You would average those. So 11 and 3, 14, 7, it'd be 7, okay? That is meant to understand sort of like how generally you change in that time. And there's still debated about what does generally mean. How does generally mean? Is that more related to back here? Or is that more related to like faster things that are happening out here communication wise? It's not exactly known, but what is known has been seen. I've seen this, pretty sure every single person who's ever spent time actually recording these and analyzing them, is that one has more variation per person, so within a person, than this one. So this one appears more often in the sports literature, the exercise physiology literature. SDNN pops up a little bit more frequently as part of understanding medical conditions. This one is used a lot more, or a variation on it, for athletic training ideas. And again, there's almost no data with these types of devices, PPG-based devices. Almost all the data. I wrote a review on this. I will put in the show notes where it is. It's open access. You can read it. Almost all the data that's been done about looking at training programs or anything else has been done with this type of device, the input device. Keep that in mind. Because the question again is, are they the same at all points in time for all conditions? So this one now is actually just looking at every beat compared to the one before it. I don't know if you can hear the thunder, but it just happened. So there is now, if you take like this one compared to this one, and then there'd be one here compared to this one, and then one here compared to this one. You would add them all up, you'd average it based upon how much time you chose to do this, and you'd have a different number. This number also is almost always lower than this number. So I believe a number of devices they're going to try and give you a heart rate variability targeted towards your workout itself. They give you that number. Sleep devices, I'm pretty sure it wasn't exactly quantified in an easy way for me to understand. I believe is more often that number. And then for, again, more general sort of medical health understanding, you get both, and sometimes some other numbers too. I should mention that this is called time domain numbers because it's a little bit easy to understand. It's based on how much time you chose to measure, and it's kind of understandable because it's just a number, like 18 milliseconds, 20 milliseconds. That's an easy thing for people like us to understand what we're supposed to do, right? If the idea is, hey, you're supposed to have 40 or more, and you're at 25, you know that I need to go up. That's pretty easy to understand. Just directionally need to go up. There's also something called frequency domain, which we'll cover a little bit of because it matters in a future podcast, which is now, it looks like a power spectrum, or like how much power is in different frequencies. And this one's hard to explain, but it's kind of like, think about being an audio engineer and you've got your favorite song, and if you've ever seen like how those track looks, where sometimes a part of it's like going up and sometimes part of it's low, it's kind of telling you what frequencies are happening in the song and how much intensity, which is a combination of how loud they are relative to the other sounds that are there in that song. And so with a frequency profile, it looks very different than this. There's also some numbers that can come out, but they're just hard to understand because the frequency bands that supposedly matter, that match those different types of heart inputs, are not cleanly separated. This is more cleanly separated, right? This is overall big ticket change, and this is rapid or like right beat to beat change. This is a little bit more understandable for everybody, which is why it gets used a lot. I'll give you another yellow flag about process. It's a little bit odd to say one of these two things is like too variable to use and understand, right? If we care about trying to help people in the real world, throwing out half the information because it's too difficult at this moment in time to understand seems a little bit weak. It's a little bit of a weak argument. I'll come back to these two different things later on, especially when we get into some of the work that I've done over the past, 5 years, 6 years. Yeah, 5 years. Okay. Now, we are going to probably stop about there. The last thing I might want to cover, heart rate variability. I'll cover one last thing as a teaser for future episodes. Hopefully that gets you to come back again. You know, I don't have the answers to a number of these questions. I actually have more questions about some of these questions, which is kind of how science works most of the time. It's very, very uncommon to have an answer to a question. It is much more common to come up with more questions to a question that maybe are better questions, maybe they lead you someplace new. So one last little teaser here about this kind of stuff right here. And again, in terms of helping people in the real world, right? You know, training ideas or recovery ideas, however you want to think about it. There has been recently, in I think only the last handful of years, and I didn't know about this until this year, 2026, there has been some research that seems to show that for certain types of people, or people under, like people in certain types of situations, that their heart rate variability changes in a way that probably wasn't expected and is certainly informative for what you might want to do with a person. So a really simple case before we get to that one is, let's say you give someone, again, like one of these training protocols. I want you to, go run, keep your heart rate around 140 to 150 for as long as you can. Slow down if you need to, or speed up if you need to, but try and stay in that band. That's a type of training protocol, right? It would say, here's a heart rate, band I want you to stay in, and I want you to do it for as long as you can. I know that you can't do it for very long, because people can't do it for very long. I think like 90 seconds is about the most. Some cross-country, elite cross-country skiers and elite rowers might be able to keep their heart rate close to this for a lot longer, but they're probably just below it. That's a training program, okay? Training programs for heart rate don't take this into account. That's not their job. Their job is to deal with metabolism and how well you perform the action you need to do. How this reacts to the training, whatever the training is, and that's a really simple one, right? Here's a cardiovascular go run program. It's unclear how it affects this. I will give you one teaser first. In some really simple experiments where I had both of these devices on people, using these two numbers here, whenever the heart rate went up, these went down 90% of the time, which means they're tracking probably about the same thing. We'll come back to that. That's a big ticket item right there, because that's like saying, hey, I've got a ruler and I've got a tape measure, and they both come out with about the same number. So guess what? They're probably both measuring the same thing, and it's not really different. But in the addiction literature, there is some suggestions where if you take someone who has the only ones I've seen so far are alcohol addiction. I know there's some work in other addiction areas to other products. Alcohol addiction showed that heart rate variability under seeing things on a screen, like a person cracking open a beer, that for the people that it went up in, heart rate variability went up, which is generally considered a good thing over time. And this is like, in the middle of a 20-minute video kind of thing. These went up, and that correlated with the addict wanting more alcohol. So that's not good, because a lot of training programs seem to think that you need to have more heart rate variability. Do you? What if you're an addict? That's a question I'll pose, and I'll leave it there. So there is some challenges here about what this can do relative to these numbers, and what does that really mean? There's also hints out there that different types of breathing techniques or cold therapy, other type, like basically rest, rejuvenation, recovery techniques, can have very different effects on this and this at the same time. And the big question is, which one is it do you need? I'll leave it there, okay? We'll think about that.